I start off by saying we can't hear the screams of people who are being tortured right now. But during this meeting, there will be many people being tortured in many of the countries that you are from, as well as other countries in Asia. And it has a devastating effect, not only on the individual who gets tortured, but on the family. And it involves not just torture itself, but the beating, the uncertainty, usually corruption and uncertainty, the about the future economically for the family of the person being detained and tortured. Bijo mentioned his book, The Locus Effect. I highly recommend that you read it. Gary Haugen is a former State Department official in the U.S. The other guy, Boutros, I believe, is still a serving official for the State Department in the U.S. And they've taken a very interesting perspective. I say, first of all, they're saying things that Mr. Basil Fernando has been saying for years. Namely that the policing system in Asia, most countries in Asia, not only doesn't help the poor when they have problems, but it hurts the poor. In that, very often the police take bribes from people, indiscriminately arrest people and accuse them of crimes, again looking for money or just for a way to solve an issue. And you also have the reality of them teaming up with gangsters or corrupt politicians to beat people up and even kill people. And this is done on a systemic basis. You maybe didn't notice there was a short article in the Hong Kong South China Morning Post a few days ago. In Mexico, a town, a fairly large town, 59 police officers, the entire police force, was arrested because they were all working with gangsters to intimidate people in the city. And I think that from the examples Basil and the Asian Human Rights Commission have given over the years, the same thing exists in many Asian countries. And so people, again, not only don't have the assistance of a police force to help them, but they're being adversely affected by the police. They go one step up, and again, supporting what Basil has been saying for years, the whole justice system. It's not just the police involved with torture, but it's also the prosecutors. You either have inept prosecutors who cannot prosecute well, and so people who are guilty of a crime get off because the defense lawyers are much better than the prosecutors, many of whom don't have formal legal training. And then you have the courts itself. The court system where judges take bribes and where various levels of officials in the court system, the clerks, the recording clerks, the serving clerks, will also take bribes to delay things, to lose papers, etc. Again, they document it very well. I cited my paper. It's a story not from Asia, but from Kenya, but it's very illustrative of similar examples which the Asian Human Rights Commission and Basil have been citing for more than a decade now. And that is the story of Caleb. He's a night watchman, comes home from work, and he goes in to bring his son to school, primary school student. He's walking him to school, and on the way, this police stop him and say, "We suspect you of doing something." He's a night watchman, a guy who's got a good job. And so they pick up Caleb, leave the son there, and pick up a few other people along the way. They bring him to the police station and beat him up. Okay? Then they go to his house, and they take the sewing machine that his wife uses to earn some part-time income. So after that, she has no way to make money. They go through the house, and they take away the money that was being saved up to pay for the daughter's education in university. Again, that means the daughter doesn't go to university. Caleb then is detained. He can't pay the bribe money because they've already taken his money. And so he's kept in detention, beaten up, brought before a magistrate, and accused of a crime of violence. And so it's a non-bailable offense. So he's going to remain in detention until trial. Again, they cite many examples, and I have a few in my paper, including India, where a person can be in detention for 15, 20 years or longer. And very often, the period of detention, pre-trial detention, is longer than the period that they would have to serve if they were found guilty of the crime. And in the meantime, they're being tortured and abused while in detention. The name, the locus effect, you can look up, it's described very well in the chapter, but the locus effect comes from an experience in the United States, the Central Party of the United States in 1875. Had just been opened up to agriculture. And the people were very happy, having bumper crops. And one spring, when everything was starting off well again, they had locusts, and they estimated 27 million tons of locusts just came through an area about the size of California in there, and they just consumed everything. Not only the plants, but even the sheep's wool, the wool off the sheep at the back, and even the wood and things. They just consumed everything in the area. And so the people wound up having nothing. And the authors are saying, in effect, that the same thing is being done by the, we'll put in quotes, justice system, because it's not really a justice system, the so-called justice system, because it's taking money from the poor. Now, they have taken one angle, which I don't think our AHRC has directly focused on, but we have said it indirectly over the years, and that is, and I think this is concerned to parliamentarians, if there's torture and a poor justice system taking place in our countries, this hinders development. And in fact, they give some statistics about how much it hinders development. Not only do the poor people lose whatever savings they have, but there's no incentive for them to work hard. There's nobody to protect them, not only their lives, but to protect the hard-earned money that they make. And there's all uncertainty. Beach started off by saying Hong Kong is a very secure society. And I think I can guarantee almost, you can walk anywhere in Hong Kong any time of the 24-hour day period and feel safe. And I couldn't do that in many US cities. And I would feel reluctant to do it in a number of Asian cities. And if I were a woman, I'd be doubly frightened to doing that. So that mental torture, that's part of that aspect of the fear of people. So the issue is that I think they're trying to make these submissions to international groups concerned about development in countries, is that to have true economic development, we have to have a true justice system and doing away with things like torture. Now, they say that, can this really be done? Is the system changeable in our countries? And I'd like to read from one section, one example, and I'll ask you to guess. I didn't put the answer in the paper here. I'll make I told Bijou I'll make an edited version of this talk, and I'll add it in. But I deliberately didn't put it in. But I'll read this out. And try to guess which city is being described here. Corruption in the city police force is endemic. From the chief of police, who has made millions providing private services to elite criminals, to the precinct captains who borrow hundreds of thousands of dollars from criminals, to purchase their appointments in bribe-rich districts, and then rake in immense profits from illicit enterprises. A famous local journalist has written that the police of this city, quote, have practiced corruption so long that they now believe it is good. They know it is, for it pays, unquote. The police do not view themselves as working for the general public, but for that political faction that appoints them. And experts have exposed that their integral role in voter fraud and intimidation. Studies have found police brutality rampant and unchecked. In fact, the chief of police has openly stated, quote, there is more law at the end of a policeman's nightstick than in all the decisions of the courts, unquote. As a result, an investigative commission concluded that, quote, every interest, every occupation, almost every citizen is dominated by an all-controlling and overwhelming dread of the police department, unquote. The city's magistrates' courts are no better. Quote, they're known to be corrupt, inefficient, and ineffective. It should be ineffective, have effective, unquote. One expert has concluded that as the producers of travesties upon law and justice, the magistrates' courts of this city we're talking about are unequaled. The vast majority of those who are dragged before the courts are poor, and 95% are arrested summarily and without process. Experts observe that while the rich are typically able to buy their way through the criminal justice system when arrested, the poor usually suffer injustice by it. Now I ask you to please venture a guess. And I'll leave the guess not to the AHRC people here, but it's only to the parliamentarians. Which city do you think this is that is being described? The point is, I think it could apply to many cities in Asia. The fact is, if you look at the book, it's New York City in 1870. New York City, 1870. You'll see it on page 217. And the reason they bring up these examples, because if we look around Asia, or if you look at your own city or your own country, you say the situation is hopeless. What can we do? Nothing can be done. So if you read on page 217 there, at the top, description 1 is of New York City in the 1890s. This was an era when the police were notoriously and openly corrupt, abusive, incompetent, and utterly owned by the kleptocratic political machines and criminal rackets, all of which were impervious to the efforts of crusaders like Theodore Roosevelt, who was in New York City before he became president later on. Actually, a little side note here, Theodore Roosevelt was a big reformist, and when he got to the attention of national people, they decided to make him a vice president to get him out of the way, because there's no power in being a vice president. Fortunately for the country and for him, the poor president was assassinated, so he took over. The president died. So, but anyway, it goes on to say, who fought to reform the system. Likewise, the police courts, as they were called, were a circus of corruption, incompetence, inefficiency, and absurdity that victimized the poor and granted license to the rich and powerful for a fee. Now, if you just read, they give other examples there. If you go turn back to page 215, I won't read it now, but you can read it later. But he talks about other towns. For example, number 2 there, where there's commercial and sexual exploitation of children, where the mayor and the police chief deputized a mob and went around killing people. And that city turns out to be Los Angeles in the 1870s. And then you have the number 3 examples where the terrible beating up of the union people and workers, and that turns out to be Pennsylvania in the 1860s, when they were trying to bust the unions, which were just starting to get formed. Then you have the police service in item number 4, and that turns out to be Tokyo. And then the 5th example turns out to be Victor Hugo's Paris. And they cite these examples, and I bring them to your attention because it shows that where a situation that seems hopeless is not hopeless. And the point I think we want to bring for discussion to this meeting is what needs to be changed. And I think the simple answer is political will. Do parliamentarians, do the public, can enough people get organized and have the political will to demand change? He goes in and says it's probably a coalition of a number of forces, from journalists, getting rid of corrupt editors of newspapers or editors who are afraid, getting in people's movements, getting in good prosecutors, getting people to demand the reform of the police, and even getting into people into elected office to make sure we have enough people in elected office to make a difference. So it's a political will to make the difference. And I think that would be the discussion we would like you to focus on today and the next few days. And I think we would like you to go through this book and refer to this, but maybe read it at nighttime and go through some more chapters and maybe some more examples. I mentioned in my paper, and I'd like to bring it to your attention now, is that rather than listening to talks, and I'm not reading out my talk as I've done in the past, but I think we'd like to have more discussion to try to provoke what can be done. We have what I might call a folk school approach of recognizing the problem, discussing what can be done to change things, rather than just listening to people and saying yes or no, to have an active interaction among the participants, particularly the parliamentarians, and to see what we can do to first analyze the problems and then to see what practically can be done. I put down here near in the last page, and I'll read this part out, what is needed to begin the process to work towards these goals. And I would suggest not only political will, but the awareness of the problems related to the justice system. And can we talk about the role of politicians and the members of parliament to try to find ways to bring about change? Last year at the meeting, I announced that Bangladesh had just enacted a new law to deal with torture. This year, we're going to have another country make an announcement that a bill has been tabled, and I'll let that to the member. I was just told. I don't want to preempt that, but another one of our participants will announce that in another country is in a process of tabling a bill, which will hopefully lead to a law on torture. And so I put down there in the last paragraph of my talk, and I'll read this part out, some things we could discuss. Do the budgets of your government allocate sufficient money to properly train police officers and to provide them with the necessary policing and investigative tools? How much money is spent in your country to develop these aspects? Do prosecutors receive legal training? Are prosecutors allowed to act independently of political coercion? Are the judges properly trained and provided with the requisite resources? Do they get enough salary, for example? Do they have recordings in the court? Do they have clerks to assist them? Do the courts have proper recording systems, and are the media allowed to freely report what happens in open court? Are there ways for members of parliament, by means of select committees, to monitor the justice system? So those are just a few questions to trigger off the discussion. So I'd like to stop there and then maybe to initiate the discussion, maybe get some initial feedback and to see how we can go further in this process during this meeting.